talk a little bit about uh, where you were born and where you're from originally?
I was born in Chillicothe, Ohio, which was the first capital. It's 50 miles south of Columbus, Ohio. And I was born in my grandmother's big, I called it the barn of the house because had so many rooms in it. We used to go up in the attic and we could hide and they could never find us and so forth and so on. I remember setting it on fire when I was 5. Me, I was the ringleader with my 2 other little cousins. Of course, they always followed. But I was born there. My granny assisted my mother and the black doctor at my birth. And whatever that's supposed to mean, you're born with a veil over your face. I was supposedly born with this veil over my face, which was supposed to make me what? A special child or a particular child or whatever. I've never connected. So I don't know. I've never understood that except when I was real young, and you're a special child. You got a lot to do. God's got his hands on you. And yeah. So that's the type of environment I grew up in. Of course, that was basically the 40s. I was growing up. They had one black elementary school in Chillicothe, Ohio, that I attended, that my mother had attended, and I guess some older aunts and uncles had attended, and all black teachers, black principal, and so forth. And of course, uh, why they had just the one, and the black kids that lived all over the city could go to the other element. I never quite understood that. But anyway, we have a tradition. We called it Southern Elementary School, and they still have a reunion every few years for us who grew up and went there. And of course, most of us went on, I guess, to junior high, high school, a lot to college, and went off into the world, and we made it. But even at our black elementary school, there were always white kids that lived in the neighborhood that went there, as opposed to going to Central or Mount Logan or one of the other, elementary school. And I don't remember growing up, in the 40s, much about segregation or discrimination or anything like that, because when we went to the kiddie shows, we had 3 kiddie shows on Saturday: the Sherman, the Royal, and the Majestic Theater. Probably were the only theaters they had back then. And we just sat everywhere and played with our friends and ran back and forth to the candy machine or whatever you call where you get your popcorn and stuff, and just had a ball.
So, so how old were you in 1950?
In 1950, I guess 49, I was born in 39, so in 49 I would have been 10. So in 1950 I was 11.
And how about those were your those were your teenage years? Um, in general, what
Mm-hmm.
was life like for you in the 1950s? You talked about sort of the 40s, but what was life like for you in the 50s and your teenage
Mm, okay, I was just coming out of elementary school, getting ready to go to what we called junior high. They didn't call them middle school back then. Getting ready to go to junior high, uh, summertime. So it was just playtime, summertime, running around the neighborhood, going on our little excursions up through the woods or whatever with different friends, and just being a kid. Other than the 2 weeks of camp that all the kids in my neighborhood seemed to go, because we had the George Washington Carver Community Center, which was started, I guess, in the early 40s, which was catty corner across the street from my church. And Mrs. Marjorie Bunch McIntyre, she and my mother were very good friends. So I wind up doing a lot of volunteer work there at the community center. Uh, Went to the day camps every year out at Mound City, where, they had day camp every year for years. And then when I was a teenager, I was a junior camp counselor myself then. But just all I remember is just having a nice, childhood. And even though my parents were divorced, I had no problem with that because I had a stepfather when I was with my mother. And then when I was with my dad, I had a stepmother. So I had parents, two parents all the time anyway. But looking back now, I could see that I was always able to wrap my step parents around my finger and get more from them than I could my own parents. I loved it. I loved it.
And where did you live during the 1950s?
Uh, Basically in Chillicothe, except for the times when I did live in New York with my dad, which during elementary school, I didn't go to school in New York. So it was just in summertime I would be with my dad and stepmother. So I went to school really in Chillicothe.
How would you describe Chillicothe in the 50s as you were coming into junior high and then high school and graduating? Because it sounds like you seem to have pretty fond memories of the community, but how would you describe that community?
Very involved. I mean, I can remember my house being one of the few houses on our block that had a telephone. And of course, back in the 40s and even early 50s, they were all party lines. So whether or not anybody was at the house was left unlocked. Neighbors could come in, get an egg or get sugar or use the phone. So, I mean, there wasn't any of this uh, type of atmosphere that we have the days that, you can't leave your house unlocked or your windows unlocked. And I guess I just found it to be just normal for those times. And of course, ever since I can remember, I always had white kids that were in the neighborhood that I mean, we always mixed, played together, fought together, went to school together. And then, of course, realizing as I got older and realizing the history of that part of Ohio, blacks, a lot of blacks in Chillicothe have been there for 300 and 400 years. They were free blacks. They intermarried with the Indians. They intermarried with the whites. So it's always been a mixed community. This thing nowadays where people intermarry, that's nothing new. That's always happened in Chillicothe.
Interesting.
And even in my own family, I can remember growing up. I had my granny's, her aunt and uncle were just two little white people, a white man and and I can't remember the names offhand right now. But I can remember aunt, and they were just white people, but they were our relatives. You know what I mean? And so we've always had that.
So, because that's what we're focusing on, but can you think of any experiences you've had with discrimination or with issues involving race in high school or anything?
Okay. I remember an incident happening at the Five and Dime. And I was in the Five and Dime. I must have been maybe 9 or 10 years old. And Jimmy Cox, who was my next door neighbor, I don't know what was the matter with that child. But anyway, he spit on me. And I smacked him down. I mean, I really smacked him. He hit the floor. And here comes all these people running. He looked like just a regular little white boy, but he was black. He belonged to the Coxes that were friends of ours that lived in our neighborhood. And so I checked him right then and there. Even though, I mean, I wasn't used to discrimination or anything, but I made them aware. That's my next door neighbor. I know who he is. I know how y'all looking at me. I said, but you don't know what this is about. And of course, that stopped it. Nobody grabbed me or called the police or anything like that. And other than that, the only incident that I had was discrimination was when I was in high school. And I had fallen asleep in study hall and taken my feet out of my shoes. And I don't know who, but somebody apparently took my shoes and moved them and so forth. So when I woke up, I'm looking for my shoes. And of course, I'm not cursing and all that because you didn't do that back then. You know what I mean? But and here comes Mr. Radar, remember, the study hall teacher. And he grabbed me, had his arm around. And so that was the only incident. And of course, at that time, my mother was the first president of the Ross County NAACP. They had just formed it a year or two before. So I remember having to meet with the school administration behind that. And they apologized. And of course, I told my mother, no, I don't want to go back to school. So they sent me off to New York to my dad. But I guess that's sort of, you know, discriminatory type thing, but I mean, it wasn't any name calling or anything like that.
Do you feel like Chillicothe was a especially different place than most of the rest of the country, or Ohio in those terms, or
Was it a little insulated from what else is going on, maybe?
yeah, or your experience in New York? Did you ever was there a sense of difference between your experience in New York and your experience in Ohio?
Oh, yeah. Well, my experience in Chillicothe was where I ran with everybody, all the kids. We all got along. It was much different in New York because I did live in Harlem, which was predominantly a black. So that's how I got introduced to the so-called ghetto and the Apollo and black life and city life and all that. Now, that I found somewhat traumatic because I wasn't used to that because of Chillicothe. In Chillicothe, we were so free and open. We were just like country kids, just running wild. Where in New York, I couldn't do that. I couldn't just get on the subway and go to Queens or go to Brooklyn or even go downtown.
It's interesting.
Hmm.
Thinking back through, you said this incident at school. I mean, you say you guess you kind of feel like it was discrimination, even though he didn't call you any names or anything like that. But it definitely made an impression on you if you said, "Oh, thanks for the apology, but I'm not going back to school there."
Well, the thing that brought that into play as far as discrimination was because my mother was with me. She was the first president of the NAACP then. She went to school with me, and of course that came out, and whatever that meant at the time, the NAACP, that was the little coloring that I saw. But I mean, there was no name calling or any of that I felt personally. So it's only from that, because of who she was and who I was, being her son. I said, no, and I just said, no, I don't want to go back to, And I guess in my own little way, I was trying to make a statement, but it didn't mean anything. But I got to go back to New York where I wanted to go anyway. So that was all that mattered.
Can you explain a little bit about party lines and how you experience them, how they work?
Okay. Of course, we could not, as children, just get on the phone like kids do today and just make a phone call to a friend or so forth. We had to get permission from whoever the grown-up that was there, And of course, if I got permission, yes, you can call your friend Doug or whoever it was I was trying to call. Then I'd have to get on the party line. And if somebody's on the party line, I'd have to say, okay, Miss Johnson, this is Jimmy Giles. I got to call my friend, something about schoolwork or whatever. Would you mind letting me have the line? I mean, you had to be courteous and, respectful. Now, that was the one thing you did not do. You did not disrespect older people. I don't care who they were, black, green, blue, whatever back then. If they were your elders, you respected them. And of course, you acted accordingly. That didn't mean that off in our own little groups we didn't curse or whatever. Of course we did. I mean, we were kids. But I mean, I can remember a couple of little incidents because even though Southern Elementary was about 4 or 5 blocks from my school. And I can remember not really doing that much, but by the time I got home, my mother went, so-and-so just said that they just saw you and you were arguing with some kid down. It was reported before you even got home. So I said, these people are insane. They're stark raving mad. But that's the way life was. I mean, children being raised, I think up through that time, they really were raised by the whole village. I don't think it had anything to do with black or white or whatever. That's just the way that they were. Much more so, I think, than today.
Better or worse?
Then or now?
Because of that.
I think I had a fantastic childhood compared to what these kids go through today with bullying, and everything they got to go through. No. I don't remember anywhere in my school of anybody allowing anybody to be picked on because of how they looked or anything like that. Of course, we had a few booger eaters. I mean, that everybody, you could, but real bullying and that, I don't remember any of that.
How would you describe the roles of men and women in the 1950s from your perspective?
I guess they were what were thought as traditional back then. Men were men and women were women. However, even though I had friends whose mothers didn't work, they just stayed in the home because they kept having babies. My mother was not one of them. She had us three, me and my 2 sisters. And then she went back to school and went back to work. And, so I, particularly during my teen years, I remember both she working and my stepfather working. But then looking at the neighborhood, I think more black women worked probably then as maids or cooks or some little type of part-time job to help, meet expenses as opposed to maybe some of the white families that we knew. But that was just basically all, I think, basically just economics.
But do you think there were pressures to fit in a certain way back then? And do you think there are similar pressures today? Do you think there's a relationship between sort of the way people understand their roles today and in the 1950s?
I know, like my mother, who was a nutritionist, dietitian, and she was the first one for the Ross County Head Start when they started the Head Start program back in the 60s. She worked because she wanted her own money and because she didn't have to be at home with us. See, my granny wound up living with us. So my Granny was a disciplinarian, the one that watched the kids, while my mother worked, my stepfather worked, or they did whatever they did in their own personal lives. And Granny ran the house with us kids, getting our meals and all that. So that was just normal for me. And I, and of course, my granny living with us and helping to raise my two sisters and myself, that was sort of a change compared to a lot of other households, because most other households were just the father and the mother, maybe a older brother or uncle or something, but it wasn't where the grandparents, because looking back now at my life and my mother and her different siblings, my grandmother ruled across all her 5 or 6 children and their children. Looking back now, because I can remember every Saturday morning during the 40s, wasn't just me and my 2 sisters. It'd be my 3 or 4 cousins from across the street, the ones from up the street. They all had to meet at my grandmother's. And of course, she lived with us most of the time. And well, particularly after she lived with us. And she'd give us our dose of castor oil. We had to take a teaspoon of castor oil every Saturday to clean us out from the junk that we had been eating all week, whether we had candy or not. And even back then, I said, these people are insane. These grown folks are out of their minds. I knew they were insane. So, but I learned that from an early age. I picked up on that when I was 3, when I started observing that I knew grown folks were insane. So certain things you had to learn about them, and in order to be able to get over and all that. But but I can remember that. And here would be 12, 15 of us lined up to get our castor oil. Oh my God. That was horrible.
Did that continue into the 50s? So when you were in your teens?
No. And I don't know if it was because probably because I became a rebellious teenager. You know what I mean? It probably had a lot to do with it, that I just didn't get caught up in that Saturday morning ritual, or I had other things to do as a teenager and so forth, so I was able to break from that tradition. But say, up until I was 10, I remember. And of course, how much control do you have, with grown-ups in your family until you reach a certain age?
What did rebellion look like in the 1950s? What did it mean to?
What did it mean to be a
teen?
rebellious
What did it mean to be a
teen?
teenager in the 1950s? What was that? What was that like?
Oh, I remember supposedly being grounded. It didn't mean anything. My mother would tell me, well, you're grounded. I still was able to go to the teenage dance on Friday, hang out with my friends. So I don't understand what it was for anyway, why I was supposed to be it made no sense. It just made no sense.
So when you were in high school, since you didn't have computer games and cell
Mm.
phones, and TV was what it was in the 1950s. What did you do? What did you do to have fun? What did it, as a teenager in the 1950s? What did fun look like?
Uh, Going to all the, of course, the basketball games, the football games, baseball games. Uh, oh, a big thing back in the 40s and 50s also was the Youth for Christ. That was the Billy Graham thing that they used to have basically on Saturday nights at all the different churches in Chillicothe, and it was called Youth for Christ. Now, I remember that and going to a lot of those meetings.
So it sounds like church was right.
Oh, yeah, yeah. At 11 years old, uh, I grew up in the First Baptist Church of Chillicothe, which is the oldest Baptist church west of the Alleghenies at that time, I guess still is. And I can remember my minister and and people from my church getting me appointed as vice president to the Sunday school convention. I'm only 11 years old. What do you know at 11? I mean, grown folks have always done this. You know what I mean? I mean, it's never been kids that have been involved. And here I am at 11 years old, thrown into the lion's den with these crazy older people and have to go to these meetings and think, don't know half of what they're talking about and don't care. But for 2 years, I had to deal with that. But that was just the politics of the older folks involving younger people looking back now at that time, because personally, it wasn't something I would have chosen.
Would you say your then was a religious community? What was? Well, let me ask that question first. How would you describe your neighborhood in terms of religion? Did people go to church every Sunday?
Most people went to church every Sunday. Uh, some of my Catholic friends, they went to church every day because St. Mary's was in the same neighborhood. They went to school and the church. So I remember having a couple Jewish friends when I was growing up in Chillicothe. And they used to come up here on Friday evenings to whatever type of services. And I can remember me being allowed once, I guess I must have been about 8 or 9, to accompany them. To me, it was just a trip, away from home. So, I mean, what do you know at, 7, 8, 9 years old, except that you're escaping from home and parents or whatever. And, but yeah, people went to church. Yeah.
What do you think do you think that spoke to the community, or how did that affect you or your family, knowing that like you guys were very involved in church, everybody around you very much was?
Well, it gave me the foundation and the interest to read a lot about different religions. And okay, I can remember my mother and stepfather letting me take catechism, even though I was raised basically, the home church was Baptist. They allowed me to do that for a year. Uh, and I can remember some of the different type of religious books, whether it would be about Buddhism or Judaism or whatever, having access from that, from the library and thing, because looking back, I guess even though I grew up in a very small town, Chillicothe, Ohio. Why? I don't know. But both my mother and my stepfather were very cosmopolitan, in their thinking. They were very liberal, in letting us do what and exposing us to things, because I can remember during the 40s and 50s coming up here, then bringing us on many trips to where the Board of Election is now. That used to be the old Vets Memorial, and that's where they used to have the big shows for Duke Ellington, Sarah Vaughan, Ella Fitzgerald, Billie Holiday, and so forth, and exposing us to all of the so-called black entertainers at that time. And I can remember us coming up to the Ohio Theater, seeing Porgy and Bess and Carmen Jones. And because that stuff never got to Chillicothe until, whenever. So, we were exposed, to stuff like that. But of course, that probably had a lot to do with my mother and my stepdad and their couple friends that they had, because they used to go to Canada a lot back in the 40s and on their vacations, and they were exposed to whatever they were exposed to. You know what I mean?
What kind of music were you listening to in high school and during the 50s?
Basically rock and roll. And of course, even just a couple years ago, at one of the all high school reunions that I attended in Chillicothe, I don't know who it was, somebody that remembers me from high school. You still dance? I said, don't you see me out here on this, out here, trying to shake a leg? They said, oh, well, yeah, okay. Do you remember when you won that? I said, yeah. Oh, so I remember back in 55, I guess it was 1955, maybe 56, only 15, about 15 or 16. My dance partner all through, we came up and we were on Gene's Canteen, that was a forerunner before Dick Clark and band, whatever, the national thing. This was a local thing here, and we won the dance contest here in Columbus, Ohio. And of course, that became a big thing in Chillicothe, because they only had 3 stations, NBC, ABC, and CBS back then. And we got our little record players and a couple books and whatever it was as prizes that they gave us, But that was a big thing.
So rock and roll. Who was your? Do you have any favorites?
Of course, I liked Elvis, but Fats Domino. I can remember him coming the Chillicothe Armory, which was a big thing in Chillicothe. It must have been 3,000 or 4,000 people, outside the armory as opposed even inside the honor. And and they used to have the big dances out there at the Ross County Fairgrounds with all the different traveling bands at that time. So,
Well, do you remember the first time you saw a TV?
probably, was it 50 or 51 is when we first got one. It was either 50 or 51. It's when I remember us having our first TV.
And what was TV watching like in the 1950s?
On a little screen like that. The screen couldn't have been no more than 6, 8 inches. And of course, no color. And that's probably part of the reason why I didn't care nothing about Kukla Fran and Ollie and Howdy Doody and all that, because I couldn't see myself trying to get my head all up, in that mess with the rest of these kids listening to this, and I thought they were silly anyway, But like, during the 50s, I remember Red Skeleton. I remember him. I liked him. What was it? Pray to Stars. Those type of musical programs I like. And what was it? Before Hallmark Hall of Fame. It wasn't Ronald Reagan.
Before Hallmark?
Yeah, it was, but it was somebody like Ronald Reagan who introduced the show whenever it came on, would give a quick background, and then you'd sit there for an hour or two and watch it, whatever it was. And of course, that was before all the nature shows and everything like they have now. Of course, I mean, my God, the stuff that you have to pick from now. I mean, I think it's fantastic. Technology has really, really, really advanced.
So, did you have a favorite TV or movie actor or actress?
Lucy Ball. I love Lucy. During the 50s, yes, it had to be Lucy Ball and Desi Arnaz. Because those are the only regulars I can think that I watched regularly.
What was going to the movies like in the 1950s? Now you pay $15 and you get a giant tub of popcorn and a huge...
Okay. You could be given 50 cents to go what we called the kiddie show on a Saturday. 5 cents would get you in. That's your fare. You had 45 cents that you could just stuff yourself with all kinds of popcorn, candy, all kind of junk with 50 cents back then. And of course, some kids, that's what they did. Once they got there to the kiddie show at noon, they stayed until 6 or 7 o'clock, until the late evening shows, you know what I mean, until they were put out. And then the adults came in for the evening. But, and it was all the cereals, all the Hopalong Cassidy, I guess Roy Rogers serials. Uh, they even had, no, most of that was radio. The Shadow, Superman, all that was radio. That wasn't the movies.
Did you listen to a lot of radio in the 50s?
Grand Ole Opry. We weren't, okay, even though the rock and roll was just starting to come out. I don't know what it was with my granny, but I guess rock and roll was just a little too advanced for her. Now, when she controlled, we were with her. We could listen to Grand Ole Opry on Sunday evenings. We could listen to the Toscanini on, what was it called? That NBC Symphony Hour, and maybe he would be on there with the New York Philharmonic, or Marian Anderson as a singer, or Joan Sutherland, or whoever was singing, the different arias and so forth. Those were the only things that as far as being controlled by my grandmother, but of course, on our own. Little radios started back then, so we'd have our own, and we'd get at each other's houses and be dancing and carrying on and listening.
What was it like? You said you listen to Elvis, and you're kind of being alive and kind of coming of age and being a teenager as that type of music was changing. You came from the Duke Ellington stuff. You came from the stuff, the Grand Ole Opry, and then
wham, a complete change. Liberation. It was liberation. Because, wait a minute, don't misunderstand me. I like Duke Ellington, Nat King Cole, all that I grew up listening to, as far as what they call them. They had hi-fi. They had the hi-fi set up. And we'd listen to, but when the rock and roll really hit, and even the Beatles in the mid-60s, and Janet Joplin, and it was completely, music took a complete turn. And it all started with rock and roll. Even though the blues had been around, gospel, spirituals, they hadn't intermixed so much. I think probably Elvis was the first one that sort of mixed blues, country, and rock and roll together before people realized that was what was happening. But he's really the one that really did that, that took it on an international scale. Even though, I'm sure that there were those other ones in smaller venues that were doing it too. But
what was it like in the 50s? Did you feel like you were represented, or was that even a concern of yours? What was that experience?
I had no problems with this racial thing because of the way that, I guess, growing up in Chillicothe, we all mix. We all live, so I didn't have any of that. You know what I mean? Okay, I can remember back in the 50s, we had a Black Panther Party in Chillicothe, Ohio. That was before the real Black Panther Party, but that's what we called ours. But it had nothing to do because that It wasn't a racial thing. That was just our little group that we called ourselves, of us teenagers who thought that we were grown, who smoked, drank a little, hung out together. We called ourselves. But it had nothing to do with the political atmosphere. And I don't think, at least from my own experience, it wasn't no big political thing. It was no big thing back then. Now, I can remember, I guess it must have been 51 or 52. My mother was the president, as I said, the first president of the Ross County NAACP. And I came up here on the bus to attend a state convention where Thurgood Marshall was the big thing. And of course, we all knew about Thurgood Marshall even back in the 50s, before the Supreme Court, thing in 54. But I was just a kid. I was just going there because I was getting a free dinner. My mother didn't want to go. Miss McIntyre, none of the adults so they didn't want to, I guess, not use the ticket or whatever. So it was put on me. But I mean, to me, it was just a trip coming to Columbus, and of course, having to deal with these adults at this dinner, And I'm saying, oh, God, don't they ever learn?
What are your memories of sort of the universe of what was going on in the world compared to your personal experience?
Okay, I was aware of Emmett Till, and all that. But it wasn't something that was just drummed into us. I mean, if we were inquisitive about it, I guess our parents talked to us as much as possible, or they thought that they could, because at that time I don't think there was any real psychology as to how to relate to kids in these type of, you know what I mean? And of course, I was aware that this had happened and all that. But it was so far removed, from my own experience that I only got all this since I've gone to school since, took Black Studies, history, and as it affects me and how I think today. But back then, you're a kid. Most kids don't get caught up unless, I guess, they're in really deplorable situations. They don't get caught up in the mess, so to speak, of whatever the situation may be, whether it's nationally or even within their own families, unless they're right there in the midst of it. They're not aware of really the dynamics of, really what's going on. So, and as a kid, you're thinking as a kid. And you're just trying to be a kid and have fun and do your own thing. And
do you think, looking back on it now, you were a little isolated from some of these national, you were aware of it, but you didn't, like you said, it seems so far removed. Do you think you felt, I guess, a little more isolated from those things because of, like, your family, because your family wasn't talking a lot about it, or because of the community, because of the way you grew up, it was such an open thing, or?
Across the board, this, like, news is instantaneous now. It wasn't back then. You got it in dribs and drabs. So that's how a lot of it just seeped in back then because of the news media or the outlets and the way it was disseminated. So that has a lot to do with it as opposed to today. And for me personally, I'm glad it was that way because I'd probably be in the nut house or dead or whatever if okay, now I can remember the 60s much better. Friends of mine going on freedom rides, go, and they trying to get me. I said, oh, no, 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 no. I wasn't taught to turn to the other cheek. If I go down there, either I'm going to be dead, in jail, crippled, or whatever. I said, because I was not taught to turn to the other cheek. I knew me well enough to know that I could not, do the nonviolent thing. And that's just speaking for me personally. And of course, there were a few other friends that were the same way. But we had friends and I applaud them. And they loved their experience and all that. Great for them. I didn't need it personally. I just didn't need it. Wait a minute. Stonewall. I was in New York when Stonewall broke out in '69. I was over at Peter Rabbit having a ball, and then coming up the street through the West Village, but after all this raid had gone on down, and of course the cops still out there trying to carry on. Now, of course, I'm glad I wasn't in Stonewall at the time that happened and I got my head cracked. You know what I mean? But I mean, to get the residual effect of it and just, to be there to witness it from that, it was an experience. And that was all I needed personally. I didn't need to be right in the mix. But I've never always needed to be right in the mix of anything anyway. That's just my personality.
During the 50s in New York high schools, was homosexuality even something? What was the experience with that? Was it even something people were aware of, or I know it was talked about? What was that like?
Of course, homosexuality's always been around. I've always had my little boyfriends, girlfriends, and all kind of friends. And okay, I never got busted by an adult catching me in any type of position, with any friends, whether or not we were playing together or whatever might have been, even though those things did happen. Now, as far as me being me and my voice and me being what Rob calls me today, you're still just a switch. I'm talking about Rob Berger, my best friend. I said, I was back then, and I knew it. I said, I knew I was a little diva. I said, but my grandmother let everybody know from the get-go, do not mess with my child. Do not call him out his name. That's just his artistic expression. I said, and that's the way it always was within the family and amongst friends. And I said, but I can remember was it the 60s? I had an older gay friend that we used to go to the Chicken Inn in Chillicothe. And we'd be with 3 or 4 different guys, and we'd just drag them out on the floor and pay the people no mind. I had no problems. I had no conscience. I didn't feel bad about it. I'm sure people talked about, but they never got in my face and disrespected me. They never did. But that was, maybe it's because of the way I carried myself, or they knew my reputation from when I was a kid, because I remember being in kindergarten, and I don't know what happened, but one of the kids was sick on me in kindergarten. I took off my Buster Brown and beat that kid down. And of course, none of the other kids could break it up until one of the teachers came out. And I guess from that reputation, they know, don't mess with Jimmy Giles. He don't take no crap. So I was always, so I don't know.
But what would you say is the biggest difference? If you had to think about one thing or a series of things between being gay in the 1950s and being gay today, or the cultural understanding of being gay in the 1950s and being gay today.
Being gay today, you can be gay today without a whole lot of hang-ups and problems. And I can look back on my experiences, even though I may not have had bad experiences myself because of the way I was raised. I had friends that did. And I guess just because of the personality and the person that I am, I refuse to let any of that, affect me personally. I was just always me. It was always going to be me. And you were always going to give me my respect or get the hell up out of my face. And that's just the way I was. And that's the way I've always been. But I had an unusual upbringing and raising, so I understand that too,
So can you describe either something you witnessed or something that would have been pretty discrimination or picking on or something of someone who was gay in the 1950s when you were in high school? What would that have looked like?
There were no incidents. And even though I had friends and they had boyfriends or girlfriends, it was always what they call it on the down low now. It was on the QT then. People were very discreet. Not that they were in the closet. They were just discreet in how they got together, but people did their stuff. But I don't remember any incidents where anybody got busted by the parents or in school or the locker room. Nothing. Because I think we were a little too bright for that. We knew that this was supposed to be a no-no. So it wasn't something that you're supposed to be, you know what I mean, that you could just do out in the open. So, I mean, we were very much aware of that.
Was there a fear of getting caught among you and your friends? And was that based in just teenagers getting caught fooling around, or was it more specifically based in getting caught in,
A homosexual
activity? Yeah.
being caught in a sexual activity, not just homo, but even a regular hetero, you just did not, let anybody know that this girl and this boy, they're screwing all the time. Now, amongst us, we may have known it. Amongst the parents or the older siblings or whatever, there might have been an inkling. But we were able to keep pretty much everything on QT. We were very much aware of what we could do or couldn't do. I mean, we're much brighter than what, people gave us credit for.
Good to be underestimated at that point.
Definitely.
But what are your memories?
Okay, my dad was stationed, I think, in Japan. My older cousin, he was in Korea, so he used to write me. And I didn't know of anybody that got killed or anything like that, so none of that came up. So other than them just being in the army or the military, that was basically it. There wasn't anything else, associated with that was traumatic or horrendous or anything else.
So, what about other aspects of sort of the Cold War, specifically things like the fear of the bomb? Do you remember practicing drills in school?
Well, as I said, during the 40s and up to 54 until they got rid of this, the only black school that they ever had in Chillicothe, elementary school. We didn't have any air raids. I don't think it was a big thing to us. I don't know if it was just for the administration or for Chillicothe, but I don't remember us ever getting underneath desks or any of that. We never did any of that.
Once you get to high school, none of that?
None of that. Mm-mm.
So did you have kind of, some people spoke of this pervading sense of concern. It was like after World War II, they were worried that, someone would be attacking America or they'd hear planes overhead. But you guys you didn't have any of that.
No, we were kids of the 50s, rock and roll and everything. I mean, we didn't have any. I mean, that was for those folks that were involved with that to be talking about that. But I don't think it affected most of us in our mentality.
Did you know anybody that had a bomb shelter?
One family, only knew one family in Chillicothe that had a so-called bomb shelter. And I don't know if they ever went into it, for anything. I mean, for the, check on the supplies or anything. I think they just built it because that was part of the thing to do, and that was part of their image for whatever their image was, that they must have it. Because I know one question about keeping up with the Joneses. There wasn't none of that. There wasn't any middle class. upper class, middle class. You know what I mean? When back in the 50s, we didn't think like that. There wasn't any of that was being documented.
Did you have a job in the 50s while you were in high school, or
Yeah, my first job was at the age of 12. I was a yard boy for Mrs. McKellum, which was right across the alley from the middle school or junior high that I went to. So for the seventh and eighth grade, I worked there as her yard boy. And of course, cutting grass, shoveling snow, so forth and so on. Then in the fall, taking all the plants that were taken from the, what do you call that? What do you call the heating rooms for the plants and stuff?
Greenhouse?
Greenhouse. She had a little greenhouse on the back of that, and then putting them in there for me to water them over the winter before putting them back out in the yard for the spring. I did that for 2 years of middle school. And then, of course, from the age of 14, I guess, through high school, I worked 2 years, 2 weeks every year at day camp for the Carver Community Center. A couple years, I worked as a junior custodian at the community center, cleaning up. So, I mean, I worked as a teenager for my own little extra money, and so did my sister. She babysat it, and so forth.
so? Do you remember what your hourly wage was?
Miss McAllen started me out 25 cents an hour. So for me to get $6, $7 a week, that was good money. This is what, 51? So for me to even get that many hours in, that maybe that I would get $5 to $7, that was a lot of money for me back then.
What'd you spend it on?
I don't even remember, probably junk, like most kids do, because all my necessities, my clothes, food, school stuff, all that was taken care of by my, mother and family. So I don't remember having to spend money on stuff like that.
Were you buying records?
Oh, well, yes. Now that as I got older and was working, I'd buy records, and stuff like that. Or I'd buy an occasional shirt or something that, tickled my fancy. But, okay, now I remember arcades. They've always had arcades, where the hockey machine. They've always had those, or whatever the old arcade games were, because I can remember going to them with my dad, down on 42nd Street, in Broadway in New York City, But I didn't care all that much for that, I just did because he wanted, I guess be hanging with me or whatever.
What would you say? What would you say is the biggest difference culturally, if you can answer this, between life today and life in the 1950s?
The biggest cultural difference. Okay. Today, there's a proliferation of greed mongering, mendacity that did not take place back in the 50s. Even though, okay, they may have still been more of the racial thing, and a lot of that hadn't been resolved here in America. Like, uh, blacks could marry whites in certain areas, or it was illegal, or whatever. Uh, even, and you didn't have bullying. That is one of the mainstays of the day. This bully stuff, whether it's in the political arena, the social arena, the religion, whatever, is prevalent today compared to what it used to be. And so that is a new phenomenon for me to try to get my head around and so forth. But even though we had our problems in the 50s, 40s, and 50s, uh, we didn't have the Voting Rights Act and all that, even though that didn't affect me personally because I grew up in Chillicothe, Ohio. We voted. You see, that's the difference between, I guess, not being exposed to segregation, the hardcore, like down south, and being raised in why a lot of this never affected me. But life has been very, very, very interesting now. These 73 years, believe me. And it has changed a lot, and I love it. And I'm not in a hurry to transition to the next phase anytime soon.
What's the one thing that 73-year-old Jim Giles would want 11-year-old Jimmy Giles to know?
Oh, 73, looking back at when I was 11.
Start in the 1950s. All that ahead of you.
That your granny was right when she used to have you on her and she'd be rocking in her and she was telling you, you're a blessed child, you're a special child. One day, you're going to go to Ohio State University, which even I can remember being 3 and 4 years old. She called it the Harvard of state schools even back then. She predicted that I was going to go to school, to Ohio State, graduate, so forth. She didn't know when or how. And she did say that it would be later in life for me, which that's the way it happened too. So when I finally graduated in 99, I graduated with my second and third undergraduate degree in 99. And I had completed.
Did you go to college after high school, immediately after high school? You said it took a while to finally graduate. But
No, I refused. They thought I was going to either go right in, and I don't think so, because I had a few gay friends by then, by living off and on in New York, and one got to travel all over the world with this retired Army colonel. And I'd only see him maybe once every few years that we'd get to run into each other when he'd be back here in the States because he was mostly elsewhere. But I thought that he lived such a fascinating life just to be the secretary to this retired and be able to travel the world. That's what I want to do. So when I got out of high school, I went to the Southern Ohio Technical Institute and took my secretarial science for a year. And then I worked office jobs for a year. And then I went, was in New York, came back in 71. And for whatever reason decided, okay, it's time for me to go on and get serious. So I went on to OSU. So I was there from 71 to 74 for 3 years until my mother kicked the bucket. And I left there in my senior year, went back to New York, lived and worked until 93, and then came back in 93 and went back to school, got my BA in Black Studies and English in 96, got my BFA in painting and drawing in 99, and my BA in journalism in 99. So I wind up getting 3 undergraduate degrees as opposed to the 1. All of my family in Chillicothe were, even when I was young, Buckeye nuts. Now, when I was young, I used to, what is this madness? Buckeyes, Buckeyes. I mean, before I understood really, competition, games, football, and of course, now I'm a Buckeye nut, particularly after going to OSU. Of course, I watched them up through a couple nights ago, March Madness, and hated it when they didn't go any further. But that's the way it is. But yeah, I'm a Buckeye nut too.
Well, now during the 1950s, in 1955 and 1957, the football team won the national championship. I assume at that time you weren't.
Was that Woody Hayes? Oh yeah. Yeah. Wait a minute. My stepfather. Oh, they thought he was. They thought he was God. My God. Yeah, they thought he was God. And then Bus Morris, he wound up going OSU from Chillicothe. Now, was it during that period? It probably was doing, but he didn't pay for the football team. He tried, but he didn't. Oh yes. Woody Hayes, Jack Nichols. Oh my God, all these people are gods. Oh yes.
And of course, the basketball team won the national championship in 1960. Havlicek and.
But even with the basketball finally coming into its own then, still football reigned. This is still really a football. I'm really into the basketball. But I go to with different church members. They got, the extra. I'll go to the football game, but I'm not out sitting in that cold like I am sitting inside in the arena.
What are your memories of the night of the Stonewall raid? You said you were in New York. What is your memory of that experience?
My memory, It was a fun night. It was a great night because we were all down on West, which is right on the pier, and we were at Peter Rabbit, boogieing and carrying on. And then coming up, I'm trying to remember the street. Anyway, coming up the street, and the street really being crowded and getting through the crowd, and so I just saw the after effects of the raid at Stonewall, by being able to look in, peep in through the window and all that. But and then all the conversation that was going around, of course, it was spreading through the crowd for those who had not participated, but were just getting the gist of what had happened. And people were, I guess, going off by themselves to, different houses or restaurants, all-night restaurants, to discuss it. And
Was there a sense? Do you remember a sense at that time that this was that something had changed, that there was something different about this than, or was it just like it? I mean, because something sprouted from that was different than it.
oh, I knew just by the uprising. That took me to the stratosphere. I knew that this was going to be change. I didn't know to what extent and how the movement was going to move and all that, but I knew that things would not be the same again. I knew that this was a turning point.
Did you feel like, was that a shared feeling?
I think that was a shared feeling, particularly amongst the larger crowd that was there on the street, because most of us were gay out there anyway. I mean, I'm sure that there were, different points of view for whatever reason, but I think the overall was that it was long past due, that we should have, what do they call it? Monday quarterbacking. You could always look back in hindsight. But even with that, I think people knew, people that had been around or were aware or have lived whatever lives they had lived. I think basically to our core, we knew that this was change that was not going to be stopped. It was going to continue. Now, here we are in this day and age. Noma is on the chopping block. Legalized gay marriage is just around the corner. I expect to see it within my lifetime, and it never was no big thing to me, personally. Because I knew that I would never, ever be in any long-term relationship where I was going to wake up and be facing you every morning and we're going to be living together for 10, 15, 20. I knew that I was not made that way. I knew this. So I've loved my life for what it's been. But for those people who have those on, I said, it's happened. And when the president came out, there's no stopping it. Just like the Arab Spring and our own civil rights back in the 50s and 60s. I mean, once these things really take get a foothold, it just evolves. So, yeah, I expect to be attending some friends' wedding in my particularly in my church. I'm Episcopalian, so we're very liberal anyway. We been blessing them and everything else forever anyway. So that's me as a grown person. I'm an Episcopalian. So I've even evolved from being a Baptist when I was young to, what I am today. So, but it's been a fascinating life. It has been. And it just gets better every day. Even with the chair, and I've had 2 heart attacks, 2 bouts with colon cancer. Even with all that, I wouldn't change. I have no regrets. I love life. And I still expect to wake up in the morning on this side.
Plus, I expect 11-year-old Jimmy Giles probably would have loved that machine.
He would have. He would have. Because I loved my bike that I had. And I loved my first car that I had. That my mother got for me when I was 15. Because I told her, I said, no, I can't wait until next year, until I'm 16. You got to sign for me to get my drive. I said, I can already drive. And so she went for it. She signed for me at 15 to get my driver's license. And of course, the next time it came around, I corrected it. You know what I mean? Because, nowadays, you couldn't get away with that because of computers and everything else.
What was your first car?
It was a Dynaflow 48 DeSoto.
Did you have friends in the 50s in high school who also had cars, or were you?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Not that many. Now, that was the one. I had my car. So on my block, I never even thought about that before. I guess I was the only teenager on my block of maybe at least a half a dozen teenagers that had his own car. Never thought of that before, see? And of course, they're piling up in my car for us to run out to the country to this, whatever they call it, carryouts or whatever, to get our beer because we couldn't get it in town. Oh, God. Yeah. But I never even thought about that. So I was one of the, so I never even thought about that. So even in that sense, I guess I was blessed. You know what I mean? I had my own car. Even though, I was chauffeuring friends around and everything. At least I had my own transport.
Do you remember how much gas was?
Oh, my God. 15, 17 cents a gallon, something like that. Very cheap. Wait a minute. a dollar or two could probably almost fill up your, gas tank back then. If you had $5, it easily fill up your gas tank back then. Not today. God.